Good afternoon again. Welcome to Rhyme of the Times 2022, a review of the year 22, 12 months of chaos and plenty too. We're still on part 1, Life in the UK, and now it is Act 2, Liz's turn, which she somewhat spurned. She started stern but got fingers burned, and so turned to U-turns, until we learned that Sunak had returned. Within a week, 11 runners and riders, from the usual suspects to rank outsiders, were chomping at the bit with heart and soul, ready to fill the Boris-shaped hole. A football team's worth of flaws and talents, definitely with a more right-wing balance. Raymond Shishti dropped out before the race started. By the 12th of July, Shaps and Javid had departed. So we were now down to the final 8 that entered the Conservative starting gates. Tories who mourned Boris could find no solace. There was a no-show from their favourite Ben Wallace. The first round of voting saw Zahawi out. Ambivalence over Boris played a part, no doubt. Jeremy Hunt was no more in the hunt by then, missing the required 30 votes by more than 10. Suella Braverman was then out of the mix. 27 votes saw her leave the Super Six. Now there were just a handful of candidates, and a new challenge brought in: TV live debates. Polls suggested Truss did badly in the first 2, but the MPs still voted her and Sunak through. The third debate with Sky didn't even take place. Badenoch and Tugendhat had by then left the race. Penny Mordaunt then dropped out in the 5th ballot, just 8 votes behind Truss. That wasn't a lot. Sunak as leader was the Tory MP's wish, but it was now down to a different kettle of fish. The 180,000 or so party members would decide on our new PM in September. July 22nd is when the starting gate gun fired. An unrepresentative elite had 6 weeks to be inspired. A pragmatist and an ideologue on a mission to offer their policies, philosophy and vision. The summer holiday dates of the UK schools provided the parameters for setting out their stalls. The 6 weeks of hustings for many became boring, filling news programmes that the country was ignoring. It seemed like a Conservative private affair to choose our Prime Minister. Was that fair? The occasional verbal gaffe, usually from Truss, was all that was newsworthy for some of us, like when asked if Macron is friend or foe, a diplomatic line she failed to toe. The jury's out was her regrettable retort, her mouth working before any process of thought. She also accused Sturgeon of attention-seeking, in another demonstration of foot-in-mouth speaking. So we had Wooden Liz with her money tree plans, and Slick Rishi, the down-to-earth monetary man. And though the former Chancellor tried and tried, his betrayal of Boris he couldn't quite hide. The party grassroots, many still Bojo fans, decided they had to choose Liz and her fantasy plans. The result came forth on September the 5th. By then, though, a Truss win had become when, not if. Truss called it the longest interview ever, as Boris's last thread was finally severed. For 6 weeks she and Sunak had debated, campaigning for Tory votes unabated. The Tory MP's choice had clearly been Rishi, but the party grassroots decided on Lizzie. 57 to 43% was not that large in comparison to recent winning margins. Her acceptance speech was in monotone, brief and unremarkable, a bit of a drone. Delivery was the speech's central thrust, of policy, not speeches, we had to trust. The handover began next day in Downing Street. 7:30 Tuesday morning in late summer heat, Boris gave his valedictory address, describing 3 years of unqualified success. More trademark mythology he then threw at us, comparing himself to Cincinnatus, a fated Roman leader who gave up power, then returned for his people in their needful hour. Boris and Liz then flew to Aberdeen for the official handover with the Queen. The Queen's mobility was in such poor order, the protocol had been transferred to north of the border. Not Mum's fault, it is what it is. Balmoral, not Buck House, for Liz to meet Liz. Boris, brought down by his own bad morals, now brought up on his own to Balmoral. He jetted to Scotland in good time, arriving in Aberdeen in faint sunshine. Half an hour later, on the other hand, Liz's aeroplane just couldn't land. For a while it circled like a bird of prey, then the fog cleared to reveal the airport runway. Even though the Queen was very frail, in executing her duty she would not fail. She accepted Boris's resignation, then Liz asked Liz to lead her nation. By bad weather on this day Truss would be dogged. Back in London it was raining cats and dogs. When her cavalcade reached the seat of power, she was greeted by a right old shower. Her colleagues and supporters looked on soaked, as from the Downing Street lectern Liz Truss spoke. The two speeches we'd heard 9 hours apart, marking Johnson's end and Truss's start, somewhat mirrored the weather of the day, from blue sky thinking to desolate grey. A tumultuous start to Truss's regime. First off, she named her cabinet team. Her first PMQs was quite assured as she faced Sir Keir across the floor. No flashpoints, no Johnson-like drama, even a quiet well done at the end from Starmer. The next day came the energy price guarantee, a massive 2-year government subsidy, pinning the average dual cost 2.5 grand, prompted sighs of relief up and down the land. The Commons debate was then distracted by the sound of scraps of paper being passed around, like bored little children in a maths lesson. Then Headmaster Hoyle interrupted the session. Those slips of paper passed around with stealth were describing Her Majesty's declining health, and so the Speaker of the House paused the debating to announce Her Majesty was deteriorating. Slowly but surely the country kind of knew, and at 6:20 the dreaded news came through. And so time seemed temporarily suspended as the nation accepted the Queen's life had ended. The weather again had turned to gloom, a clear and obvious portent of doom. What strange forces, seemingly dark and evil, could have conspired to create such upheaval? If Liz Truss was superstitiously inclined, by Saturday she would surely have resigned. Instead she went to Buckingham Palace for a word with the newly proclaimed King Charles III. So politics took a backseat for 10 days of mourning. Then 23rd of September, almost without warning, Kwasi Kwarteng announced his mini-budget, a long intake of breath before people could judge it. The Chancellor received a collective Commons frown, with more rabbits in his hat than Watership Down. Even Tory backbenchers questioned his sums. Immediately we heard the squeaking of bums. While analysts tried to pick through the bones, many fretted about the budget's right-wing tone. less levelling up, more trickling down. Tax cutting the only strategy in town. The country, far from level, looked like one big slope with the north at the the north at the bottom, devoid of any hope. Was this quasi the Chancellor or a quasi-Chancellor? Or maybe it was simply quasi the Chancellor, because the new Chancellor of the Exchequer gave a plan with no independent checker. No Office for Budget Responsibility had been asked to check the credibility of Kwarteng's calculations and figures that led to the national debt getting bigger. Without the OBR marking his homework, the markets marked it, and they went berserk. Within 2 days, the pounding of the pound caused collateral damage all around. Sterling being pulled by gravity, almost dropping to dollar parity. It's hard for economists to coalesce, but most had foreseen this financial mess. Even after IMF's slap on the wrist, Truss and Kwarteng would persist and resist. The Bank of England didn't like what it had seen and felt compelled to intervene. While resisting another interest rate hike, it soon took action to reduce a spike in the interest rate on government gilts, something about which Kwasi seemed to feel no guilt. Bank of England boss Andrew Bailey said the bank would buy the bonds for 13 days daily. 65 billion of financial aid pledged to keep our economy away from the ledge. While interest and debt went out of control, Truss and Kwarteng seemed to go AWOL, presenting Starmer with a huge open goal to increase his massive lead at the polls. Had he the nous, the skill, the blag? Or would he hit the post or the corner flag? His conference speech hit the back of the net when he said we should never forgive or forget what the Tories have done to our economy, and that Labour's now the party of sound money. For some, his tone was still a bit grating, but Keir gave the air of a PM in waiting. He got gushing applause, standing ovations, capitalising on Tory perturbation. But this wasn't just Tory bashing from Keir. He actually brought some of his own ideas. Great British Energy, a new company, state-owned for national security, to make the UK self-sufficient in terms of energy that's cost-efficient. The home crowd in Liverpool had clearly been wooed, capturing the new Labour Party mood. A great conference for Keir, but then, flip. An unwanted intervention from Rupert Huck. The MP for Ealing, Central and Acton expressed views that caused a bad reaction. A fringe meeting audience was taken aback when she called Kwasi Kwarteng superficially black. But Keir and his party were quick to act, and Hook was hooked, politically sacked. On Thursday, Truss came out of hiding. On local radio she took a hiding. The 5-minute slots on BBC stations were presumably meant to calm the nation, but the deafening silences just added more tension as she seemed to not quite grasp the questions. Finally, as the turmoil wouldn't let up, Kwasi Liz and the OBR chiefs met up. The Tories then went off to Birmingham with many serious issues concerning them, putting on an air of hunky-dory, but that was not the true Tory story. Kwasi's mini-budget still had them reeling. Like Sterling, they had that sinking feeling. Leader Liz Truss under pressure already, slim hopes that she could make things steady. On the morning of the Chancellor's keynote speech, the familiar sound of a U-turn screech. It wasn't of Kwarteng's own volition that he undid one of his big decisions. The day before he'd been chucked under the bus, driven on TV by his boss, Liz Truss. So next day Kwarteng brought back the top tax band, not what he had wanted or indeed planned. His speech hours later was a little subdued. in keeping with the conference mood. The Health Secretary, it seemed, had read the room when she gave her speech amidst gathering gloom. But coffee couldn't keep the audience awake. By the end, they all needed a coffee break. Her material wasn't exactly cheery. NHS problems make everyone weary. Therese gave her ABCD to-do list. Ambulances, backlogs, care, doctors, dentists. And so to Wednesday. It was Truss's turn to pull it out of the fire or crash and burn. Her moment of truth, and she gave it some hammer, although there was some deliberate stammer. Growth, 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 her economic vision. Wrong, 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 are the anti-growth coalition. And there could be an almighty collision, given the size of her perceived opposition. Trade unions and environmentalists. Even many Tories are on her hit list. Greenpeace broke the peace while Liz Truss spoke. 2 women were removed by a few big blokes. This actually seemed to galvanise Liz, giving her some uncharacteristic fizz. Her mantra, we must grow the pie. Her critics say it's just pie in the sky. But she and Kwarteng would not be accosted by the small point that their plans are uncosted. And so on stage, with such high stakes, the Tory leader made few mistakes. Behind her, behind her the Tory tagline was striking, getting Britain moving, when train drivers are striking. Throughout the conference could be heard the sound of discontented voices all around. Home Secretary Braverman talked of a coup from those not supporting what Truss wants to do, and so of Suella, her detractors spoke ill. Less Suella Braverman, more Suella de Ville. Next day, Truss was in Prague to make another speech, less confrontational, more outreach. The European political community is all about energy and Europe's security. A few months ago, Liz Truss was a sceptic, but in Prague she now seemed to accept it. She even called its architect Macron a friend. The lady not for turning, now showing she could bend. Her premiership had become mired in a bog. Next problem came from Jacob Rees-Mogg. He wanted to have a public campaign on energy savings to ease household pain. But the business secretary's plans were thrown out. A nanny state ain't what our Liz is about. People were now asking, can things get any worse before Truss's premiership bubble is burst? Mid-October she had her Chancellor binned. Kwarteng was out, Jeremy Hunt ushered in. No doubt Kwasi had worked out his end was nigh when back from Washington he was ordered to fly. He'd cut his visit to the IMF short to be told that he no longer had Liz's support. And support for Liz there now wasn't much. She hadn't got many straws left to clutch. Certainly her Home Secretary was no more an ally. The Truss-Braverman friendship had quickly run dry. A few days before, Truss had turned on Suella. She felt she had no option. She just had to tell her that being tough on migrants is not what we need for her pet growth agenda project to succeed. But Hunt's first statement effectively said Kwarteng's growth plan was all but dead. The unfunded tax cuts plan was now in tatters. Gaining market confidence was all that matters. And on the day Kwasi was told, on your bike, the postal workers had their first day of strikes. A familiar refrain of poor pay and conditions, the reason behind this walkout decision. With other industrial actions still ongoing, Truss's in-tray was more than overflowing. So her government limped on to fight another week, with a shaky cabinet that continued to creak. Rumours of plots by Tories so cross that the plot of their party had been totally lost were so clear even Liz could read the room. So she quit, October 20th, early afternoon. The Sunday before, the die had been cast. Speculation on just how long Truss could last. In the Commons on Monday a pantomime show, as the whole House desperately wanted to know, where was the increasingly elusive Liz? What kind of erratic leadership was this? Penny Mordaunt, for over an hour, took the flak, gallantly standing firm in the face of attack. Then suddenly catcalls as Hunt slipped in. "She's behind you," they cried as Liz followed him. The Chancellor came to save the flagging pound and save the flagging penny so she could sit down. Liz said not a word and departed soon after to sarcastic goodbyes and cynical laughter. Hunt was at the stand and in full flow, explaining why Kwasi's plan had to go. Almost the entire mini-budget of September was now being systematically dismembered. Truss admitted she'd gone too far and too fast. Hunt now put her growth policies in the past. Most Tories now wanted Liz Truss also gone, knowing this charade simply could not go on. There was still to be one more twist in the tale, in this barely believable Conservative tale. The Home Secretary, yes, Suella Braverman, erstwhile Liz Truss friend and a Trussonomics fan, quit over an email security lapse. The Home Office baton was passed to Grant Shapps. But was the real reason for Suella being out just an errant email? Many still doubt. She accepted the reasons for her to resign, but reading carefully between the lines, there were enough sour grapes for a whole case of wine, suggesting she had been axed from the Truss pantomime. As with Kwasi's hasty loss of his role, was this just Liz trying to regain control? Whatever, it didn't help her to survive. Next day she herself picked up her P45. After just 45 days, she was out on her arse. But the Tories remained to continue this farce. The government's complete loss of direction left many desiring a snap election. They felt this should be the end of the funfair. Continuing with this government was simply unfair. The Tories agreed, but they only agreed snap election was required to choose their own leader. And by the weekend rumours were spreading. Back from his holiday Boris was heading. The blonde knight of Uxbridge was on his way. As he'd promised, Cincinnatus would save the day. All the while the cost of living crisis got worse. No sign of inflation hitting reverse. And despite Hunt's efforts to get markets calm, Kwarteng's cameo seemed to have done lasting harm. In the end, Boris Johnson had second thoughts, despite claiming he had the party's support. For Mordaunt, the penny also dropped, and she decided Rishi shouldn't or couldn't be stopped. And so 7 weeks after he initially failed, through Number 10's revolving door Rishi sailed. At least another drawn-out campaign would have been spared. The Tories went down the Coronation Street instead. October 24th, 2022, the Hindu Festival of Light, the day Britain had its first PM who's not white. And so those who had thought Johnson's reign was short, in hindsight, should clearly have held that thought. Liz's tenure was over before it had started. Trussonomics was ditched, and off she was carted. And the last 12 weeks, without tempting fate, has seen the Tory tempest somewhat abate. Hunt's first budget on the 17th of November, unlike Kwasi's, is barely remembered. Indeed, due to the pitch being thoroughly pre-rolled, it seemed much more benign than the rumours foretold. The familiar smell of austerity back in the air, but a rise in spending for schools, health and social care. Taxing energy firms and the rich a bit more, energy cap remaining to keep wolves from the door. But there's no doubt there'll be more pain for the nation with high interest and double-digit inflation. But after the mayhem of Johnson and Truss, calmness at the top suits many of us. But PM Sunak still raised a few eyebrows. His first cabinet reshuffle, much comment aroused. Perhaps the shuffle that aroused comment the most saw Braverman back in her Home Office post. Within weeks, more stories of her email leaks and the migrant overcrowding that caused Manston to creak. And she does have a blunt way with her words to ensure her sharp messages are clearly heard. And in November, Rishi almost missed the trip to the COP27 summit in Egypt. But he U-turned and his decision was flipped. The summit was important, so it couldn't be skipped. A few weeks later, plans were laid for Britain's first new coal mine for 3 decades. Then there was the Gavin Williamson departure after an unbecoming and drawn-out saga. The cabinet minister without portfolio denied bullying claims but still chose to go. It turned out that the PM may have known more of this skeleton in his cabinet than he'd let on before. And though he says he cares so very, very much, someone so wealthy must be a bit out of touch. Sunak often just can't read a room which is full of mere mortals not blessed with his riches, like at the soup kitchen last week when he tried to discuss jobs in finance with a poor homeless guy. In 2023, Rishi could be in more hot soup in trying to rally his Conservative troops. Backbench opposition is starting to fester, not helped by the by-election train smash in Chester. And Stretford and Urmston kept Labour in place in a low turnout poll and a one-sided race. The Tory party, so fractured, it's in need of sutures, and many Tory MPs are praising their futures. And while the population struggles to survive and strikes are blighting our everyday lives, although, must say, compared with the daily strikes happening in Ukraine, we should perhaps think more before we complain. The Prime Minister has to rapidly learn when to compromise and when to U-turn. And as 2022 fades into the past, the question remains, how long will he last?